Good evening. So, we're up to the last of the 10 Sefirot, Malchut, which is unique in many, many ways. We've discussed the activity of each of the other energy flows of creation, which we've called Sefirot, and we've demarked the ones that deal with mind, and we've also nominated what each of those three, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, do by way of consciousness of the mind. Then we spent time looking at the three that deal with our emotional dispositions, Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes. And now we've been looking at the three that deal with taking the balance of mind and emotion and translating these into an interpersonal, relational context. And that's what we've analyzed over the last few sessions, which makes this very last one, Malchus, rather strange because it's passive. Now, when I say passive, what we mean here is that it doesn't have any overt activity of consciousness, but rather it's the result of all the other nine. So what we're talking about is actualizing the original game plan. So, you've thought through the design of your home, you've considered all the aspects that will create a sense of comfort and pleasantness and light and joy, and now finally you step into the house. Malchus is stepping into the finished house. It's entering into the abode. So Malchus is the collection of the other 9 Sefirot in their various permutations and combinations, resulting in a state of being. So it's a being rather than doing. And you know that in various discussions on the nature of spirituality, there's a whole cause célèbre about the concept of being rather than doing. The word being has a much better PR than the word doing does. It's also that much more spiritual, that's that much more abstract. Somehow beingness is much more attractive than doingness. But of course the short answer is both are absolutely necessary. You do in order to be, okay? You carry out activities of life in order to achieve a state of fulfillment. Malchus is the beingness from the doingness of the other 9 Sefirot. The original parents of this whole process were the parents, the father and mother, known as Chochmah and Bina. So what we said was that Chochmah impregnated Bina, masculinity and femininity. And in this very process of Chochmah and Bina coming together, father and mother coming together, mind, consciousness came into being. But the result was also that as you focus on mind, as you practice da'at, as you really narrow the line of thought, and do it profoundly and deeply, it awakens a feeling. So it was also the mother of the other Sefirot, the Midot, those particular aspects that became known as our emotional expressions. Whereas Chochmah, the first, the origin, the beginning point of consciousness, is referred to as koach ma, the potential of something. Chochmah is what begins anythingness and creates somethingness by way of mind consciousness. And it's called koach ma, and therefore it has the capacity, therefore, to implant its seed, so to speak, in the womb of Bina. And the resultant world that we've been talking about is called Alma de Iskasio, the hidden world. Because when the child is still but in the womb, we cannot see the child. It's a hidden world. And through those Sefirot of mind and emotion that we've been talking about, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, and then Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, and then Netzach, Hod, Yesod, it's still a hidden world. Now comes Malchus, and this hidden world starts to become revealed, and it's given birth to, as opposed to conceived. So conception took place between the parents of Chochmah and Bina is referred to as the higher order mother, or in Aramaic terms, we talk about it in terms of the Ila'ah, the higher state of being, the Ima Ila'a, the higher mother. Now we're coming to the point of birth. Birth is Malchus. Birth is when the child enters into the world. It's when we enter into a kingdom, Malchut, the kingdom as such, which has been constructed. Therefore, Malchus is referred to as the lower mother. The mother Tata, Ima Tata, the lower mother. Bina being the higher mother, meaning that conceives, and it's all in a hidden state. Now in its lower state, not qualitatively, but in terms of bringing things lower into a materiality from an abstract spirituality, that becomes known as the Imitatio, the lower mother, and now it becomes a revealed world, a world of time and space and consciousness. These are the three dimensions of this world of Asiya. There's nothing outside of these three: time, space, consciousness. Can you conceive of any other property of this world? And you'll find you can't find anything outside of these three. But these are all items that are measurable to an extent, or experienced as consciousness is. That's all right. You're allowed to have beautiful music playing in the middle of a shiur. I welcome it, Remember what I say? I say that whenever you play music, it tells me a lot about you. So would everyone please turn their phones on? Okay, right. Michael, please edit that. All right. That camera's called Michael? Okay. So I'm not talking to myself?
You could be talking to this mic.
Okay. Okay, Michael. So in Malchus, potentiality is actualized. A kingdom comes into existence. And Malchut is like the funnel through which the Ein Sof, the infinity that conceived of everything, funnels down into the real world. So the lowest point, Malchus, is intimate with the highest point, Chochmah. So in a sense, if we were to draw, and there are many ways of diagrammatically portraying these, last session we looked at a number of different diagrams that help us pedagogically to understand the interrelationship. But if we were to draw the Sefirot in three columns, there would be a left column, a right column, and a center column. And the center column would have at its apex the very, very source of everything, Keter, which we haven't discussed, the crown that sits on top of the head, supra-consciousness, and Malchus at the bottom. They will be part of the middle column, the middle pillar as it's referred to. And that relates to what we taught last week, that the end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. And we looked at ends and beginnings and their interrelationship as Sefer HaYetzirah teaches. So the very conception of the idea at its formative stage must relate to the end product perfectly in order for the two to be bound. So Malchut relates to the highest point. And therefore, Malchus is also referred to as Shekhinah. The word Shekhinah is an interesting word. You will know it from the Hebrew lishkon, to dwell, or shachen, a neighbor. Shekhinah means the sense of presence. And Shekhinah means the way that Hashem inhabits the world. It's a feminine quality. It's a feminine side of the Godhead. And the Shekhinah maintains the existential condition of the world as such. And as a consequence of that, it is the world. Now that's a short summary of Malchut in its place of the Sefirot as such. You would consider the very last one that we discussed last week, Yesod, as really the faucet, the tap, through which the other Sefirot flow into this container of Malchut. Malchut is the receptacle. Okay? The world is a receptacle. Shekhinah means a receptacle. In other words, we are here receiving from all the higher elements, the higher worlds, and this is the result, Malchut, a spiritual kingdom that materializes. Now, having completed, therefore, the consideration of all these 10, now let's look at how we operate here. because this is where God has a sense of humor. Gives us a capacity called free choice. We are the joker of the pack, okay? We have been given the gift to be a co-creator of an unfinished universe, and we can either continue the process, tikkun, fix it and complete it, or God forbid, we also have the free choice to destroy it, to maim it, to hurt it. Now this is the biggest mystery of creation. Bechira chofshis, free choice. And yet there, as we've said over and over again, through free choice comes the meaning of life. Because if we didn't have the capacity to kill and destroy, life would be meaningless. It's our capacity to choose right from wrong that provides all meaning in life. Nothing else counts. And every aspect of our mind consciousness and emotion consciousness, every one of our thoughts, every one of our words, every one of our behaviors is an act of choice. Admittedly, we can act by rote, which means habitually, without too much mindfulness, without thought input. But that's a very low order operation in the world of time and space and consciousness. We begin the capacity rather to act in a high order, and that means exercise of choice as such. This process we call mastery. It's a common word. And I want to speak a little bit about the way that we master the way that we act in the world. A, what does mastery mean? And secondly, what is the methodology of Jewish mastery? What are the goals of Jewish mastery as such? Now, mastery always refers to behavior. In Jewish thought, speech is part of behavior. In other words, we're not artificially distinguishing between speech and body activity. It is a body activity for the purpose of our discussion here. In other contexts, we may distinguish it. So let's consider speech. Speech is, as we've heard previously, a wondrous process. Speech means not just the physiological processes of air flowing and impinging on the voice box and then being shaped by the 5 parts of the mouth that shape sound, the lips, the tongue, the teeth, the palate, and the throat, corresponding to the 5 levels, the 5 worlds, which includes the Ein Sof as such. And that is merely the production of sound. But the way that the mind, at the very same time, instantaneously shapes that sound so that the sound becomes a container for something that's within to be revealed without. I take my inner self, and through speech, I reveal that to you. It is indeed a most wondrous phenomenon. And when Hashem speaks, the result is creation. And that's why the narrative of the beginning of Genesis is all about God speaking. And of course, we only use the analog of human speech to understand it, but God's speech reveals also, in the same way that our speech reveals ourselves, God's speech reveals a world, which is a revelation of itself also, of the godly self. Now, how do we take the processes of speech and master them? So there's the more obvious areas which Western and Eastern societies deal with, and that's called diction. We teach little kids how to pronounce the words correctly, how to make the sounds phonetically correct, etc., etc. But when we talk about mastery of speech, we're not talking here in terms of those physical properties, are we? We're talking about to what extent can the capsule of sound encapsulate the intent within our mind and heart. Now, if I had you for a month or so, and we would go away and have a month-long retreat just on speech, we would learn how to speak again like from babyhood onwards. But this time with a great asset. The asset is we have mature minds. So we would then spend a long time considering how the sounds are to be formulated, not for diction, but to best encapsulate myself honestly and truly, so that I become visible to you, as would be appropriate. We become visible to each other to different degrees of propriety. I remember when I was in law school many, many years ago, here in Melbourne University, and we had a visit from a very well-known judge of the English appellate court at that time, Lord Denning. And he was a very, very charismatic individual who was prepared to buck the system, and we young students all rolled up for his lecture. He was our hero. And there he was, and the title of the lecture was, "The Most Important Law in Society." Fine. We were ready for it, and we wondered, was it going to be criminal law? Was it going to be international law? All the things that are really major? No, it wasn't. It was the law of privacy, he said. The law of privacy. And then he began. And in passing, he said as follows: if you were to be riding on the Clapham bus, now there's a suburb called Clapham in London, and there's a Clapham bus. And the Clapham bus is used in English law as an example of the typical situation in the public arena. If you were riding on the Clapham bus, he said, and you happened to see somebody whom you've never met before, it's very unlikely that you would even go up to them. However, if on the same bus you were to encounter someone whom you had a nodding acquaintanceship with, it's highly likely that you would nod at them. And what if you met on the bus somebody who was a friend? It's highly likely you would go up and actually speak to them. And what if you met on the bus somebody who was a close family member? You might go up and actually embrace them. He said, our right to display the degree of our inner self to the other constitutes the main basis of civilization. As soon as this is destroyed, whether through the big brother syndrome or whether through other forms of fear, we lose the essence of civilization. And therefore, the degrees of propriety of allowing our inner self to touch the other is an important factor. That's called morality and ethics. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking just the capacity to be good at the skill of allowing ourselves to present ourselves to the other. Some people have great difficulty using words to express themselves to another. Some people have a good degree of difficulty even having the courage to open their mouths to speak to another. That was what we discussed in previous weeks in terms of Netzach. But we're talking here in terms of, okay, how do we do that? So the course would consist of this if you were to spend a month with me. Firstly, what we would do is you would have to count 5 seconds before you said anything to anybody else. That would be the first week. Now, if you think that's not hard, just try it for a few minutes in any conversation and you'll see how difficult it is. But in that 5 seconds, which is an enormous period of time, I mean, it's as long as this. Now, that's pretty long if you have to pause before each sentence like that. But what would that do for you? I think the nature of the words that would come out would be radically different than the ones that tend to come out from our mouths in normative conversational sense. Now imagine if you did that for a week, and the following week you reduce that then to 3 seconds, and the week after 2 seconds, and the week after 1 second. What you would have done in the period of time is to be able to train the interconnection of the nature of consciousness through the facility of forming the words, so there's a much closer relationship so that the resulting sounds become a much more accurate connecting point between two people. Dibur, speech, is a terribly important manner of achieving fulfillment. Because we said that the primary motivation of people's lives is what? We said it's connectedness, joining, take the twos of life and creating ones. By speaking, we're joining. When I speak to you and you process what I say, there's a point of connection. And when you speak to me, there's another point of connection. And these points of connection can become more and more profound. And that's why the skill of mastering speech is such an important one in Jewish spiritual endeavor. I haven't really found that notion in any other spiritual pathway, interestingly. But the idea of the mystery of sound and its capacity to encapsulate consciousness and to be able to share that with another, that is something wondrous. No? So that's what we mean in terms of revealing ourselves and then appropriate self-revelation. Then there are ways of expressing which are not necessarily revelatory, not just me allowing my inside to different degrees to be open to you. There's also the adoption of formulas of speech, meaning if I take other people's wise teachings and wise statements and I learn to adopt these, then what I'm doing is changing my habitual pattern of speech and elevating it to a higher point. I'm actually leapfrogging my own limitations by allowing something higher than me to become part of me. And that's why imitation can be very valuable. Like, if you really want to feel what another person feels, the best way is to engage in situational experience. You have to, or in the common phrase, put yourself into the shoes of the other. So, for example, you want to see how a youngster of 6 months or 8 months experiences world? Get down on the floor and start crawling. And you get a much better experience than trying to figure it out by looking at the child and asking, so, well, what is the child really seeing? And I shared that with you last week when I said that what I learned when I injured my knee and spent a month in a wheelchair and seeing the world from that height of seated in a wheelchair as opposed to my normal state of being upright. Even that little change in position gave me a completely different perspective. I could actually see shadows under people's chins, just to notice a little thing, okay? I mean, there are a lot of things that you perspectives alter, etc. You start noticing different things, placing yourself situationally into the place of the other person. And then also that is important. So that's what we mean by adopting wise sayings. So, for example, if we say blessings, although the word blessing is a very arcane word, antiquated word, but if we adopt the Hebrew of interconnection of letters and words that describe through the mind and eyes of the last prophets, Anshe Knesset Agdola had the last prophecy in that august body, then what we're doing is we're mimicking those words. But then when we adopt it, part of our own lexicon and our own understanding is elevated thereby, then, as I said before, we leapfrog our own wisdom to a higher state. Anyway, that's a little discussion about the mastery that comes in terms of words. Then there's the mastery that relates to behavior. And behavior has many more components. It doesn't just have the 5 components that formulate sound, but there's the components of every single part of the body and slight movements of the body. The human being is an acutely sensitive organism. I mean, you know, if a Martian were to land on Earth and look at our choice of cars and how we would recognize a slight variation in the shape of something major, right? You know, you cannot compare a Ford to a Holden. To a Martian, a Ford and a Holden might look exactly the same. But to us, the subtlety of that difference in shape, even more so. Our faces. Here, we all have two eyes, we all have two ears, we have a mouth, we have a nose, and yet every one of us sees the slight variation in each other to the extent that we can recognize each other from each other. I don't know if you ever considered what a wondrous thing that is. The subtlety to which human beings are able to define the slightest differences, even when it comes to art and major art pieces and the various vantage points, and what people see in the art. One person sees this in the same art piece, and that person sees something completely different in the art piece, and the like. Okay? So if we then multiply all that in terms of our observation of different parts of the body movement, if we can master our body movement so that there is, and here's the operative point, congruency between the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave. So that the body is not giving a different statement to the other than what the person's words are, or the person's heart is, or the person's mind is. The Talmud says we should train ourselves so that the inside is the same as the outside. That means who we are in the privacy of our home after hours is the same who we are during the business hours of our profession or otherwise, and vice versa, because you and I well know the kind of schizophrenic behavior that some people display, one persona in the workplace and a completely different persona at home, and I'm not sure which is better or worse in many instances, okay? And that's unfortunate. That's really offending exactly what the Talmud is asking us to do, to be congruent. Now, of course, congruency requires us to have a beginning point. There has to be something good to be congruent with. Most people's intentions are good. We call that kavanah. Now, the word kavanah comes from an ancient Aramaic word called kabin. Kabin means literally a window in the Aramaic. Now, what we're saying is that the way that we formulate our intention provides a window for the neshama, for the soul, to peer out into the world. What I intend creates the pathway for the soul. Okay? It's a profound notion. So the word kavanah doesn't simply mean, as the modern Hebrew has it, intention. It's more. It's learning the skill of allowing our neshama to flow in an optimal way.
In English, cabin, window is only part of a cabin.
The point being that what we seek to do is to adopt wiser and more optimal windows for the soul to peer through. Better intentions. So let's assume that human beings by nature wish the best for the other and for themselves. So let that be the beginning point for the purpose of measuring our behavioral self. Do our behaviors match up to our good intentions? And that's part of behavioral mastery. And then you practice that systematically. What am I doing with my eyes? What am I doing with my eyelids? You can be much finer, eyebrows, if you will. What am I doing in terms of more obvious things like hands and feet and body and movement, etc.? Why do some cultures become much more expressive with their bodies and other cultures are more stoic with their bodies? What does that mean? Well, certainly it's harder to read a stoic individual than it is a flamboyant individual. You know, Italians are much easier to read than Englishmen, right? Okay. But that's a cultural thing that results from other factors also to do with the energy flow within and emotional states, and we're not going to go into that, but it's very, very interesting in its own right. But nevertheless, each culture in its own way, to be able to understand what the different nuances of body are providing by way of truth of the mind and the emotion at the moment, at the time. That kind of mastery practice. So, you know, here we are, we live 120 years, and most people never, ever entertain mastery. They just continue living the life with the body that they've been lumped with, in their opinion, with the mind which has been endowed to them by genetics, with feelings that are somehow affected by other people causing things to them, etc., etc., and they continue living entrapped lives instead of the liberation of plasticity of mind and emotion. You know, the emerging field called neuroplasticity, which is telling us that we have the capacity to change the way that our brain actually functions and even physiologically exists, changing the neurotransmitting patterns within our brain, that we have the capacity to change everything about ourselves. That's freedom, that's liberation. And that begins as an act of will and willpower and discipline and practicing mastery and habituating new patterns of thought and habituating new emotion responses and being much more aware of what's happening within the body as such, and thereby allowing the words to come out in a way which is optimized. All right, you guys ready for the 4-week retreat? Yeah, sure. That's what we have to try to do in order to make this work. Okay, so we've spoken about a little bit in terms of speech, a little bit in terms of behavior. What's this ultimately for? So there's a wonderful Latin term called Imitatio Dei, which literally means copying God. What it means is, firstly, where's God? Wonderful theological question that plagues every generation. And of course we say, even to our children, God is everywhere. Very difficult notion. What does that mean? So Spinoza says, God is nature. Very profound statement. And that's wonderful. And it appeals to many people. And the one-time Baruch Spinoza becomes excommunicated from his Jewish people because somehow by saying God is nature is heresy. And yet, when I study Hasidus, you know what Hasidus says? God is nature. Just a second. How come Baruch Spinoza gets excommunicated and becomes the famous Benedict Spinoza subsequently for Christianity, and Hasidus says seemingly the same thing? There's a very major difference. Because Hasidus says God is nature and more. And the and more, subtle as it might be, is a world of difference. For Spinoza, there wasn't any greater will. The world, the natural world, is identified with God. But it's almost diminishing God. It's reducing God to the limitations of nature. Whereas Jewish theology states very overtly that God can't be limited to nature itself. It must be and more. Everything is an expression of God. Nature is an expression of God. Absolutely true. But at the same time, it must be more than the mere expression of nature. So what we are asked to do then is to practice imitatio Dei, imitating God. So how do we do that? We have to learn the and more. What's the and more all about? In what way is the human being finite, and what does it mean, the infinity that's beyond? How are we finite? Is it just because our brains are 5 inches by 6 inches by 7 inches? What if our brains were 5 miles by 6 miles by 7 miles? Would that make us infinite? No. It would make us a hell of a lot brighter than we are now, perhaps, but that hell of a lot brighter still be limited by design. Anything which possesses design must be limited. Anything which is measurable must be limited. Therefore, the only way that we can practice ultimately imitatio Dei is to access our infinity. And that's the other aspect of what Hasidus teaches us, that within us is the point of infinity. So although we are the personification of Malchut, the end point, the receptacle that receives all the higher flows. But we said the beginning is wedged in the end, but that end is already wedged in the beginning. That somehow, when we do the finite, ordinary, limited things on the world, like drinking a cup of water or laying bricks on top of each other, or whatever might be the most physical, material activity, somehow that is an infinite desire. And we're engaging in that infinite desire. And by practicing the mundane, we're at the same time touching the infinite. How beautiful is that? That we can be doing the most ordinary things of life. And at the same time, if we do those ordinary things masterfully, with the right kavanah, then what we're doing at the very same time is touching the infinite. And that's why Hasidus democratized Jewish thought. Where previously we had elitism, where it was all a matter of scholarly knowledge, and the people who knew more and had access to more were on a higher scale in this sociological ladder of things. Comes along the Baal Shem Tov and he says, no, absolutely not. As I said previously, the shoemaker, the artisan, has equal status in the eyes of Hashem as does the biggest Talmud Chacham, the greatest scholar. And that was because the end is wedged in the beginning and the beginning is wedged in the end. It doesn't matter if you're tapping soles onto leather to create the shoe. Do that with the right kavanah, with the proper inner understanding, with the profundity of what you're doing, and you are on equal status with the person studying the most obscure piece of Talmud in the most scholarly manner. And isn't there an absolute beauty to that kind of thinking? Of course, it offended many at the time, especially the scholars. Do you mean we have to go back and make shoes? No, but at the end of the day, of course, it became a much more acceptable, to the point where today it's quite an acceptable notion. That sacredness is not simply a measurement of accumulation of information, but sacredness is the way that we elevate the ordinary into something much more. And we have the capacity to do that. So let's do a little summary of what we've been doing, and over the various sessions with various other teachers as well. We looked at the nature of the cosmos, and we were able to define through the Torah certain understandings of the model of how things work in the space of the all. We divided the world into 4 basic realms: Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilus. And we said these 10 creative energies called Sefirot flow and intercede through and refract through, transcend through these, and they become ultimately manifested in every level of existence and in the human being, and they become manifested in the human being by way of the mind and the emotion and our physical state of being. And we analyzed each of these, and we said that we have a capacity to take from the subconscious to the conscious, to be able to bring the chidush, to bring the creative aspect of self to the fore. We call that chokhmah. Then we said we take that kernel of thought, which we've just been able to arouse, and give it dimension, breadth and length, thought flow. Then we said we have a goal of a thought, focusing, and the more we focus on it, creates an array of emotional attributes. We call these attributes chagas, Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes. We said that the primary emotional attribute of the world, and therefore the human being, is outward and sharing. We said that there is an equal and opposite tendency of contraction and withdrawal. We possess both. We're constantly in a state of tension. How much should I give? How much should I keep for myself? Whatever the information, whatever the coinage might be. The result is that Tiferet comes along and balances these according to the moment, according to the circumstance, according to the situation. At that point, I have a feeling. I've already had a thought, and now I have a feeling. And then these series of 3 classes arose, and we discussed on how do we take that thought and feeling, mind and emotion, and translate that into connectedness, what we call relationship, how we relate to the world around us, to the people around us, etc. So we took Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Netzach, our wish to be able to cross the interpersonal boundary, extend ourselves to touch another person with the soul, with the mind, with the heart. And we've got the tendency to withdraw also. The good reason to withdraw, to give space for another, provide comfort zone. A poor reason to withdraw, lacking the courage, not being able to assert oneself. Whatever might be the case, each one of us then operates with attention of those 2. Yesod brings them together. The result is at that moment a commitment of some level of connectedness. And that's what Yesod does. And then finally, the result is the logical point that we've reached today. At that point, the word is said. At that point, the behavior is expressed. But these are just passive results of all that 9-point activity that we've been talking about of the 9 Sefirot above. And then the final step that we discussed today was how we take the situation within the realm of Malchut and we optimize it. And we're calling that mastery. And we spoke about how we can master speech and how we can master behavior in order to elevate it to a higher state. And we said that the standards are ultimately God-defined through the Torah, providing us with a litmus test, and ultimately to be able to imitate God, Imitatio Dei. And that brings us to the closure of these sessions.